That morning when the phone rang, former FBI agent Marcus Tyler's hands began to tremble. The caller didn't identify himself, but the voice was familiar. It was from one of the recordings he'd listened to while working in Hollywood 40 years ago. The man spoke only one sentence. "It's time to open the Rock Hudson files." Marcus had worked in the FBI's special unit in 1984, just before Rock Hudson died of AIDS. Back then, the reports about Hudson were so numerous that a special team had been formed. But under pressure from studio executives and threats from congressmen, the file had been sealed without ever being opened. Until that day. The voice on the phone continued. "Look inside the old trunk in your garage. You'll find the list of 217 names that aren't supposed to exist. You'll see how he destroyed each of their lives." The line went dead. Marcus's heart was racing. That trunk, the trunk he hadn't touched in 35 years. Rock Hudson had entered Universal Studios in the early 1950s when he was still known as Roy Fitzgerald. With his handsome face and 6'5" frame, he caught everyone's attention. But what nobody knew was that Hudson's real reason for being accepted into the studio was different. He was on studio boss Henry Wilson's special list. Wilson was famous for discovering young actors, but these discoveries came at a heavy price. The first victim had been 19-year-old Tommy Richardson. In 1951, he'd been invited to Hudson's house for a small role. What happened that night? Tommy could only tell his psychiatrist 30 years later. Hudson hadn't just used physical violence. He'd taken photographs of Tommy to use as blackmail material. "If you talk, these photos will be published everywhere," he'd said. Tommy never appeared in cinema again. When Marcus opened that trunk in the dusty garage air, yellowed files emerged. The top file's cover read, "Operation Rainbow, 1954-1984. When he turned the first page, he couldn't believe his eyes. The FBI knew of 217 victims. Each one's name, age, date of meeting Hudson, and detailed events were written down. The file clearly explained Hudson's method. First, he would select young actors or extras working at the studio. He would promise them big roles and invite them to his house. When they arrived, he would drug their drinks. When they woke up in the morning, Hudson would be standing there with a camera. "Either you continue working with me, or these photos will be in tomorrow's newspapers," he would say. But what was truly shocking was the size of the system. Hudson wasn't alone. Behind him were Universal Studios' security chief, 3 detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department, and even a federal judge. When victims went to the police, their complaints disappeared. When they went to newspapers, editors refused to print the story. The incident in 1962 changed everything. 22-year-old actor James Daniels had managed to escape from Hudson's house and went straight to the FBI. His body was covered in bruises. His arm was broken. That night there had been 6 more young actors at Hudson's house. As James escaped, he heard screams coming from behind, but couldn't go back. As an FBI agent, Marcus had personally taken James's statement. The young man had explained while trembling, "There's a room in Hudson's basement. The walls are soundproof. Inside there are cameras, lights. He took us there. Those who resisted were beaten, some until they passed out." After James's statement, Marcus had put Hudson under surveillance. Within a week, 12 different young actors had entered and left Hudson's house. They were all between 18 and 25 years old. Their common feature was being new to Hollywood and being orphaned young people without families. But the night they were about to begin the operation, Marcus's superior, Commissioner Bradley, had called him to his office. Hudson's file was on the desk. Bradley had taken the file and thrown it in the trash. "This file never existed. Hudson is untouchable. Orders from above," he'd said. When Marcus protested, Bradley had put his gun on the desk. "Either you forget about this, or you start thinking about your family." That night, as Marcus drove home, he'd seen the black Cadillac following his car. The message was clear. The power behind Hudson was bigger than even the FBI. Now, 40 years later, reading the files in his hands, Marcus felt sick to his stomach. 117 names, 117 lives. The youngest was 17, the oldest 26. Some had committed suicide, Some had become drug addicts. Some had simply disappeared. On the last page of the file was a note. It was written in Hudson's handwriting. "They are my collection. Each one specially selected. Each one marked. And no one can stop me. Because I'm not just an actor. I am the system itself." Marcus continued reading the files. Each page revealed a new horror. In 1958, Hudson had organized a party at his Beverly Hills mansion. The guest list included 15 young actors who had just arrived in Hollywood. By morning, 3 were hospitalized. The official report stated alcohol poisoning, but the real medical records hidden in this file showed signs of assault and drugging. One name stood out: Michael Patterson, 20 years old, from Kansas. He'd come to Hollywood with dreams of becoming the next James Dean. His mother had sold their family farm to pay for his acting lessons. On March 15, 1959, he attended Hudson's networking party. He was never seen again. The file contained a single photograph of Michael, taken at Hudson's pool. In the background, you could see other young men, their eyes glazed, clearly under the influence of something. The FBI had found Michael's wallet in Hudson's garden during a secret search in 1960, but when they tried to pursue it, the evidence mysteriously vanished from the evidence locker. The officer who had logged it was transferred to Alaska the next day. Page after page, the pattern became clearer. Hudson had scouts at every major acting school in Los Angeles. They would identify vulnerable targets, young men without strong family connections, preferably from out of state. The scouts would befriend them, promise introductions to Hudson, and deliver them to his parties. One scout, identified only as Raymond K. in the files, had delivered 43 young men to Hudson between 1955 and 1963. His payment records were there too: 50 tums, $500 per successful introduction. In today's money, that would be over $5,000 per victim. The file contained transcripts of wiretapped phone calls. In one from 1961, Hudson could be heard talking to Henry Wilson. "The blonde one from last night won't stop crying. Should I use the usual method?" Wilson's response was chilling. "The studio has a doctor who can prescribe something to calm him down. Then send him back to Iowa. Give him $200 for the bus ticket and make sure he signs the NDA." NDAs. There were copies of dozens of them in the file. Non-disclosure agreements that threatened financial ruin and public humiliation if the victims ever spoke about what happened at Hudson's house. The language was deliberately vague, but legally binding. Most were signed while the victims were still under the influence of drugs. Marcus found a sub-file labeled "The Cleaners." These were 3 men employed by the studio specifically to handle Rock Hudson situations. Their job was to visit anyone who tried to speak out. Sometimes they offered money. Sometimes they offered threats. Sometimes people just disappeared. There was a case from 1964. A young actor named David Chen had gone to the Los Angeles Times with his story. He had photographs, medical records, even a recorded conversation with Hudson. The night before the story was supposed to run, David's apartment burned down. David was found 3 days later in a mental institution, committed by a doctor who was on Universal Studios' payroll. The newspaper killed the story. The Hollywood Reporter had actually investigated Hudson in 1962. A brave journalist named Betty Morrison had spent 6 months gathering evidence. She'd interviewed 30 victims. She had documentation. She was ready to expose everything. Then her editor received a visit from someone very high up in the government. The message was simple: kill this story, or we'll kill your newspaper. Betty was fired the next day. She never worked in journalism again. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the file was the section labeled "The Network." Hudson wasn't operating alone. He was part of something much bigger. The file contained photographs from private parties attended by some of Hollywood's biggest names, powerful politicians, and wealthy businessmen. In many of the photos, young men could be seen in the background, looking dazed and confused. One photograph from 1963 showed Hudson with a famous senator, a studio president, and the chief of police. They were toasting champagne while behind them, barely visible, a young man was being led away by 2 large men. The young man's name was Timothy Brooks. He disappeared that night, and his body was found in the Pacific Ocean 2 weeks later. The death was ruled a suicide. The file documented how the victims were systematically destroyed if they tried to speak out. Their reputations were ruined with planted stories about drug use or mental illness. They were blacklisted from Hollywood. Some were framed for crimes they didn't commit. Others simply vanished. In 1967, a group of 5 victims tried to band together and go to the federal authorities. Within a week, 1 had died in a car accident. 2 had been arrested on drug charges. 1 had been committed to a psychiatric hospital, and the last had suddenly decided to leave the country. The message to other victims was clear: don't even try. Marcus found a letter in the file, dated 1970, from a victim named Robert Vale. Robert had written to the FBI director personally, begging for help. He described in detail what Hudson had done to him, and named 6 other victims who were willing to testify. The letter had a note attached from the FBI director: no action required. Matter resolved. Robert Vale jumped from his apartment building 3 days after sending the letter. The medical records in the file were horrifying. Victim after victim showing signs of assault, drugging, and worse. But every single medical report had been altered. The original diagnosis had been changed to accidents or consensual activities. The doctors who had made the changes were all on the studio's payroll. There was an entire section on the drugs Hudson used. He had a steady supply of Rohypnol before it was even widely known. He also used a cocktail of other substances, designed to make victims compliant and affect their memory. The drugs were supplied by a pharmaceutical executive who attended Hudson's parties and selected his own victims from among the drugged young men. In 1971, Hudson had become more brazen. He started filming what happened in his basement room. The FBI had managed to obtain one of these films during a raid on an associate's house. The contents were so disturbing that the agent who watched it had to take psychological leave. The film was supposed to be destroyed, but someone had kept a transcript. Marcus couldn't read more than a page before he had to stop. The file revealed that Hudson had kept detailed records of his victims. He had journals where he rated them, described what he did to them, and noted which ones might cause problems later. He referred to it as his collection catalog. Some entries were marked with a red X. The file noted that victims marked with red X were never seen again. By 1975, the FBI estimated that Hudson had assaulted at least 200 young men, but the real number was probably higher. Many victims never came forward, too ashamed or too scared to speak. The file contained a statistical analysis suggesting the real number could be over 500. There was a section on Hudson's protectors. The list read like a who's who of powerful America: studio executives, politicians, judges, police chiefs, media moguls. They all knew what Hudson was doing. Some participated. Others just made sure he was never caught. In exchange, Hudson provided them with victims for their own purposes. One memo from 1976 outlined how the system worked. If a victim went to the police, the desk sergeant would call a specific number. Within an hour, someone would arrive to handle the situation. The victim's complaint would disappear, and the victim would either be paid off, threatened into silence, or dealt with more permanently. The file documented several near misses, where Hudson almost got caught. In 1973, a neighbor had called the police about screams coming from Hudson's house. When the police arrived, they found 7 young men in various states of undress and intoxication. Hudson claimed it was just a party that got out of hand. The police report was filed but then vanished from the system the next day. In 1977, a brave prosecutor named William Harrison had tried to build a case against Hudson. He'd gathered evidence, found witnesses, and was ready to file charges. The night before he was going to present to the grand jury, Harrison's wife received a phone call. The caller described in detail what would happen to their children if the case proceeded. Harrison dropped the case and resigned from the prosecutor's office the next day. The file contained a list of all the people who had tried to expose Hudson over the years: journalists, police officers, prosecutors, even a few politicians. Next to each name was a notation of what happened to them: fired, discredited, bankrupted, institutionalized, dead. Not a single person who had tried to take on Hudson had survived with their life or career intact. There was a transcript of a conversation between Hudson and his lawyer from 1978. Hudson was worried that someone might talk. The lawyer reassured him, "Rock, you're protected at the highest levels. Even if someone provided absolute proof, it would never see the light of day. You're too valuable. The system needs you." Hudson had asked, "What if I get sick? What if I can't control myself anymore?" The lawyer had responded, "Then we'll handle it. We always do." By 1980, Hudson's behavior had become more erratic. The file documented incidents where he had attacked victims in public places, confident in his immunity. At a studio party, he had cornered a young extra in full view of dozens of people. No one intervened. No one reported it. Everyone knew the consequences of crossing Rock Hudson. The FBI file contained a psychological profile of Hudson created in 1981. The profiler described him as a malignant narcissist with sadistic tendencies. He enjoyed not just the physical control over his victims, but the psychological destruction. He wanted to break them, to own them completely. The profiler warned that Hudson would never stop voluntarily, and that his behavior would likely escalate until he killed someone. That prediction nearly came true in 1982. A young actor named Paul Stevens had been found unconscious in an alley near Hudson's house. He was barely alive. When he woke up in the hospital, he had no memory of how he got there. But the medical examination showed clear signs of what had happened. The hospital records were sealed, and Paul was given a large sum of money to leave the country. The file revealed that by 1983, Hudson's health was declining. The rumors about AIDS were starting, but even then, he didn't stop. If anything, he became more desperate, more violent. He knew his time was running out and seemed determined to hurt as many people as possible before the end. There was a memo from late 1983 that chilled Marcus to the bone. It was from someone high up in the government to the head of the FBI. It read simply, "The Hudson problem will resolve itself soon. No action needed. Maintain surveillance, but do not intervene." They all knew Hudson was dying, and they were just waiting for the problem to go away naturally. Meanwhile, he continued to destroy lives right up until he was too sick to leave his house. The final section of the file was labeled Aftermath. It documented what happened after Hudson's death in 1985. There had been a coordinated effort to destroy all evidence of his crimes. Files were burned, witnesses were silenced, and Hudson's history was rewritten to make him a sympathetic figure who had hidden his homosexuality due to societal pressure. But the truth was much darker. Hudson hadn't hidden his sexuality. He had hidden his crimes. The system that protected him had spun the narrative to make him a victim rather than a predator. The 217 real victims were erased from history. The file's last entry was dated 1987. It was a report on the surviving victims. Of the 217 documented victims, only 89 were still alive. The rest had died from suicide, drug overdoses, accidents, or mysterious circumstances. Of the survivors, most were homeless, institutionalized, or living in isolation, too broken to ever rebuild their lives. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed by what he had read. But there was one more item in the trunk. A cassette tape labeled Hudson's Confession, October 1984. With trembling hands, Marcus found an old tape player and pressed play. Hudson's voice filled the room. Weak from illness, but still recognizable. "I know I'm dying. I know what people will say about me. But they don't know the truth. They don't know about the system. I wasn't the only one. I was just the most visible. There are others, so many others, still doing what I did, still protected, still hunting." The voice continued. "I kept records, not just of my collection, but of theirs too. The senators who liked them young, the producers who liked them broken, the judges who liked to watch. I documented everything. It's my insurance policy. If you're listening to this, it means someone finally had the courage to open the file. But be careful. They're still out there. They're still protected, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets buried." The tape ended with Hudson laughing. A cold, hollow sound. 217 victims? That's just the ones they counted. The real number? Even I lost track. But each one was special. Each one was mine. And in the end, that's all that mattered. Marcus turned off the tape player. His hands were shaking. He looked at the phone number the mysterious caller had left. Should he call? Should he expose this decades-old horror? He thought about the victims, the 2117 lives destroyed, the families who never knew what happened to their sons. Then he noticed something else in the trunk, a manila envelope marked Current Operations. Inside were surveillance photos, dated just months before the files were released. The photos showed prominent Hollywood figures at private parties. In the background, young men with glazed eyes. The same pattern, the same system. The nightmare hadn't ended with Hudson's death. It had just evolved, adapted, hidden itself better. The predators had learned from Hudson's mistakes. They were more careful now, but they were still there, still hunting, still protected. Marcus picked up his phone to call a journalist he trusted, but then he hesitated. The last page of the Current Operations file had a list of names titled Potential Whistleblowers, Monitor and Contain. His name was on it. They had been watching him all along. They knew he had the files. They were waiting to see what he would do. He thought about his family, his grandchildren. He thought about all the people who had tried to expose Hudson and what had happened to them. But then he thought about Tommy Richardson, James Daniels, Michael Patterson, and all the others. They deserved justice, even if it came 40 years too late. Marcus made his decision. He began scanning the documents, uploading them to multiple cloud servers, sending copies to journalists around the world. He knew they would come for him. But maybe, just maybe, this time the truth would be too big to bury. As he worked through the night, Marcus kept thinking about Hudson's words. I am the system itself. The most terrifying part wasn't what Hudson had done. It was knowing that the system that had protected him, that had enabled him, that had fed him victims for over 30 years, was still in place. The sun was rising when Marcus finished. He had sent everything to 50 different journalists, uploaded it to secure servers, and mailed physical copies to law enforcement agencies across the country. Whatever happened to him now, the truth would survive. His phone rang. The same voice from yesterday spoke. You've made a choice, Mr. Tyler. I hope you understand the consequences. Marcus replied, I understand perfectly. 117 victims understood the consequences too. They never had a choice. Today I'm giving them one. The line went dead. Marcus sat back and waited. Outside, he could hear cars pulling up to his house. He had done what he could. The files were out there. The truth about Rock Hudson's 21 victims would finally be known. But as the footsteps approached his door, Marcus wondered how many more files like this existed. How many more predators had been protected? How many more victims had been silenced? Hudson had said he wasn't the only one. If that was true, then this was just the beginning. The door burst open. Men in dark suits flooded in. Marcus raised his hands, a slight smile on his face. They were too late. The truth was already spreading across the internet, reaching newsrooms, arriving in prosecutors' offices. As they led him away, Marcus thought he could hear something in the distance. It sounded like voices, hundreds of them, finally able to speak after decades of enforced silence. The voices of Hudson's victims, no longer erased, no longer forgotten. The black sedans drove away from Marcus's house, as neighbors watched from behind curtains. But in newsrooms across the country, editors were opening emails, reading documents, and making decisions that would shake Hollywood to its core. The story of Rock Hudson's 217 victims was about to break. And with it, perhaps, the system that had protected predators for generations would finally begin to crumble. Or would it simply adapt again, finding new ways to hide its crimes? Only time would tell. But for now, at least, the truth was free.